Roxanne and Miss Ron. Everybody else got that? Before we Father, help us as we study your word this morning. We'll do so in view of a vast eternity that lies before us, that's soon approaching. Found out about the death chapter that many of the Corinthians hearing, believing, and were baptized. And he spent how long there? 18 months.
hand I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weakness. For if I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me.
Okay. For him to boast in visions and revelations of the Lord. Now, I think they put that in there for a reason. Visions and I don't know if y'all saw this the other day, but I think it was out in Texas where around an airport, and these bicyclists did y'all see that, where they were riding? And I showed it to Brenda, the video, and two women in their 60s over, and he knocked the man over in the other lane, and then he stopped, and then he ran over the guy. All the wheels got him. I couldn't believe the guy was running over him with his car. But the bike just so happened to land on the pavement on his body where the car ramped up the bike and went over him, and it kept from crushing him. That was the only thing that they could explain. But he made that statement that it was a surreal, almost having an out-of-body experience. I don't know. Paul really doesn't know, does he, what happened here? And Frank's going to tell us exactly when this happened. We were discussing this before. It happened 14 years prior to this. Frank will tell the group here exactly when it happened. All right.
By putting these dates together, this experience must have happened during that 3 years after his conversion when he was in Arabia. The time frame works out. And we don't know a lot about that 3 years experience other than the Lord was preparing Paul for his ministry.
All right, we find that in Galatians, the first chapter, that being talked about. That's what Frank's referred to.
It was during this time that the Lord allowed him to have a vision or go into heaven. I don't know. He didn't in the body or out of the body. But he saw things that changed his life. And he saw things that prepared him for everything he was going to have to deal with.
And yet, during that 14 years, what's significant? What did he not do for 14 years that we know of? Luke didn't record it in the book of Acts. Paul did not talk about it in any other of his writings. How do you keep something like that inside, bottled up? If something like that happened to us, what would we be doing? We could have. That could have been the reason. That's exactly right. We don't know. We don't really know exactly when this happened or what happened, but that's a pretty good, I think that's a pretty good time frame that he's talked about. And he talks about the third heaven in verse 2. What in the world is the third heaven? Now, the writer of the material probably hit it on the head, but back then people believed there were three heavens. The first heaven was where? Where the air, the birds fly. Second heaven was fire at space that we can see, sun, moon, stars, and all that. And the third heaven would be heaven itself. Okay, thank you. That's what was common to believe, and I believe that really fits and is harmonious with everything we know about the Scriptures. However, I was in a discussion, a study with Jehovah's Witnesses one time, and they said that this proves, they believe that Jesus was a God, that he was a created being, and that it's okay to have other gods. And I said, well, what's your reasoning for that? They said, well, the Bible talks about having three heavens, and if there's three heavens, there's got to be at least how many gods? I had never heard that before in my life. You ever heard that? And I was just blown away. I said, I don't believe that's what he's referring to there, but the guy actually said that if there's three heavens, there's got to be more than one God. And I thought, that's really off base there. And so the third heaven is talking about where God resides. He repeats in verse 3 that it was unknown to him, but who did know? He says who knew in verse 3. God knows. He says he talked in a language in verse 4, heavenly language. And I don't know what the heavenly language is, and Paul didn't know either, did he? But it was unlawful for him to what? To utter. I find it interesting that there were two others that were taken up that did not come back. Paul is the only one that I can find a record of that did come back. Who were the other two that were taken up but didn't come back? You see on the screen. In 2 Kings 2 and verse 11, who was caught up in a whirlwind? Elijah. And Enoch, he was translated or taken up because he pleased God. In Hebrews 11 and verse 5. And so we find those two being taken up, but they didn't come back. Paul went and came back. It mentions the word. What word does he mention there? Where he went. Verse 4. Paradise. Okay. Heaven and paradise.
Again, early in the book of Revelation.
Where else do we find that being said? Who said today, thou shalt be with me in? Jesus said that. Where did he say that? On the cross in Luke the 23rd chapter. Yeah. Well, Frank also mentioned that that on the first missionary journey was stoned. Brother Mann is talking about when this occasion, when this incident happened. Could have been when he was stoned and left for dead. Maybe, he went and came back because he was almost dead. Perhaps some believe that. Again, bottom line, we just don't what? We don't know.
Paradise is a descriptive term. It really means garden.
Okay.
It's a place of rest, a place of beauty, a place of refreshment. That's a descriptive term that's used.
But wouldn't it be bad though? And I couldn't help but think this. Paul gets to go there and see all the beauty and glory of paradise, and then he has to what? How disturbing would that be? And it makes me think of somebody else who was raised from the dead, had already died, and was a friend of Jesus, and he had to come back. Who was that? Lazarus. My mother died maybe 4 years this coming August, and she contracted COVID at church, and she told me, she said, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else to get sick than at church. And although I lost my mom, I guarantee you right now, she would not want what? She would not want to come back. And if we're fortunate enough and faithful that we'll receive that crown of glory, we'll understand we don't want to what? You don't want to come back to this low land of sin.
Back in verse 1,
Okay.
he said, I will talk about vision, revelation. That's a not so subtle statement to these brethren and by extension to those super apostles that he was an apostle, that the revelation of the Lord. Vision certainly, nearly everybody received visions then. Not apostles did, as you already learned. But Paul emphasizes revelations in this chapter, Galatians 1 as well. He received revelation
From who? Of the Lord. There you go. Good point. He didn't receive it of men. He makes that argument in Galatians 1, verse 10. He didn't seek to please men, but he received the revelations of the Lord. And that again ties back to those 3 years that he spent where the Lord was. He didn't go to Jerusalem and learn from the other apostles. He learned.
you ask why did he not talk about these revelations until now? He didn't have to. He talks later in this chapter about signs of the apostle, these things that he had done. He raised the dead, he had healed the sick, he cast out demons, he had manifested his power as authority as an apostle already.
Great point. And he let his actions do the talking. And what do we need to do? Yeah. Great points. I appreciate that, all of you. He would not boast about his visions, but what did he say he would boast about? Verse 5. His afflictions. Now, you think about it. What would people today do if they had a true vision? And they have done it even though they don't have true visions. What would they write or what would they do to make money? They'd tell everybody. Would they write a book? Would they try to sell the copyright and then might make a movie about it? And have you seen that? Have you seen all these people that talk about having a near-death experience where they go and they see this great what? Great white light. And there's been books written about it, and people make money off that. And if Paul was interested in money, and I guarantee these false apostles would have been trying to take advantage of it, he didn't boast about those visions. But I'm going to rather glory in my infirmities in verse 5. And the reason that he did, and Sean, you touched on this. What did he let do the talking? Look at verse 6. What did he let do the talking? What they had what? seen and heard from who? Him. And what heard from Paul that Sean talked about? The great power that was given to him by the Lord to do these signs, wonders, and mighty works that he talks about.
And they had seen an exemplary life.
Yeah. Seen an exemplary life. That's exactly right. Okay. Any more comments? Let your actions do the talking. Do you have to tout that you're a Christian? Do you have to wear it on your forehead? Do you have to put it in your car? Like actions. What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Matthew 5, verse 16. Satan. God allowed it, and I believe the same is true here. He's the source of all suffering. But notice he says to buffet him. And that word buffet in the material you have, what does that word buffet mean? And Paul said, I buffet my body daily, 1 Corinthians 9, about verse 27, to keep himself in subjection. But what does that mean to buffet? That's not a buffet where you go eat. What does it mean? Beat up. And so this thorn in the flesh was something that beat Paul continuously. And what was the reason again for it? To keep him humble. And look at verse 8. He prayed 3 times to the Lord to do what? And the God's answer was what? What does that teach us? What does that teach us about prayer? Sometimes the answer is no. God knows best. Sometimes he'll tell you no because he knows what's best for you. Have you ever been thankful that you didn't get what you prayed for? Huh? I may have told this. I know I told it at River Bend, but years ago when I began my banking career, I called Gadsden, Alabama, and I hope you're not from there, but I always called Gadsden, Alabama the armpit of America because it was a dirty, nasty industrial town back in the 1970s. And I got transferred there with the company I was with. And I prayed to the Lord that he would get me out of there, give me a job somewhere. And I went and interviewed for a job in Decatur, Alabama with a bank. And I thought I was going to get the job. Interview went well, and I got a Dear Don letter a week later. You know what a Dear Don letter is? It's a Dear John. It's a Dear Don. It said, we appreciate the interview. It went well, but we decided to go in another direction. And Brenda and I just sat down and bawled our eyes out. The Lord told me what? Wasn't very long after that, an opening came up in Florence, Alabama. And I went to work for the local bank and spent my entire career there. And you know what happened to the bank that I cried about I didn't get in Decatur? Guess what happened to it? It got gobbled up years ago, and now it's some big holding company bank, and it no longer exists. And I'm so thankful the Lord told me what? You ever had something like that? And I know, I'm convinced it was a providence of the Lord. I don't know that for sure, but I'm convinced myself that it was. But he told me no, and I'm so thankful that I didn't get what I asked for. And I know you've probably had some, and here Paul prayed 3 times. And yet, what was his attitude when the Lord told him no? God said no because why? Verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in weakness. And no, he says most gladly. What did he say? I'll gladly suffer for the cause of whom? Christ. Because any suffering we go through this side of eternity pales in comparison to what? Whose suffering does it pale in comparison to? Christ.
You know, this stagnant suffering, a couple of things that I think of is it makes you stronger.
That's what he says here.
And secondly, it allows you to identify with suffering.
Okay, did everybody hear that? Suffering makes you stronger, which Paul says that in verse 10, that when I'm weak, I'm strong. And it also enables you to be able to help others who may be experiencing similar circumstances. And that is so true. Can you agree? But I want you to notice in verse 10, he says he took what in infirmities? Pleasure. Now, Deborah, I saw you kind of mouth that. So anytime you suffer, you're happy about it, right? No, okay. I'm glad you're honest because I don't like it either. But here Paul says, I took pleasure in my infirmities because it made him stronger. That's powerful, powerful verses here, isn't it, that Paul talked about. And he's leading up to what he really getting to the rest of the chapter. And this is when he's going to go after the brethren for not defending him, and also after these false apostles. Last week, I heard a prayer during a meeting at Isbel. And y'all know Brother Gerald Ricketts, whom we've helped financially. He's had part of his wife, Michelle, is on oxygen. She can hardly breathe. She can hardly get from the car to the church building. And they came a couple of nights. And he led prayer one night. Let that sink in. He thanked God for the hard times that he and his wife were suffering. You ever heard that? And he said it made him stronger. And I couldn't help but think about this passage when I heard his prayer. All right, let's move on. The rest of the chapter, the time we have remaining, verses 11 through 18. Brother Foy, would you be kind enough to read those verses for us? Yes.
I have become a fool and boasted. You have compelled me, for I ought to have been commended by you, for in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostle, though I am nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you? forgive me this wrong. Now for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. And I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. Though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. But be that as it may, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you by cunning. Did I take advantage of you by any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus and sent our brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not walk in the same spirit? Did we not walk in the same steps?
Okay, let's stop there and look at these verses very quickly. He said it was foolish for him to boast, but they compelled him to. What does that word compelled mean? They compelled him to. They forced him to. It's kind of like Simon of Cyrene. You remember he was compelled to do what? To bear the cross of Jesus. And so they forced him to. And they left him no choice that he had to. They should have known and defended his apostleship, because he was not behind the chiefest apostles. He certainly wasn't behind any of these false apostles. But he had performed signs of an apostle before them, as Sean talked about earlier. He had proven that he was an apostle by what he did, signs, wonders, and mighty deeds. The writer of the material, you might have picked it up, and I think it was one of our questions. What's the definition of these three things? Signs, wonders, and mighty deeds. What about signs? Something that it's out of the ordinary. No, it's not. But what are the purpose of signs? You remember when the Great Commission in Mark 16, they were told to go in all the world and preach the gospel, and he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and he that believeth not shall be damned. In verse 20, what accompanied them to prove what they were saying was so? These signs he talked about. And so these are some things that happen, miraculous things that happen to prove what's being said is so. Wonders are something, that's how you respond, because when people saw it, the record says time and time again, they were amazed. And mighty deeds, there's no way, if you saw something, the great power, and Sean, you talked about that, well, if they witnessed the great power the Apostle Paul had, there's no way that they could what? They could deny that he was an apostle from God. But he said he had taken no money from them in verse 13, and he asked to forgive him for this wrong. Now, he may have been sarcastic, because he said the only thing that I can think of that I did do wrong was I didn't take any money. In fact, in the 11th chapter, in verse 8, he said, I robbed what? Other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. He said, I took money from other churches to preach to you and to teach you the gospel of Christ. And if that's the only thing, then forgive me for this wrong. But I'll tell you what, he could have sincerely meant that, because sometimes when you don't take money from a congregation, you're doing them wrong. You ever thought about that? I think I've told this story before. Brother Alvin Holt, who baptized Brenda in Limestone County back in the 1970s, he was a farmer and he was very successful, but he took no money from the Oakland congregation where I grew up. And when they went to hire a full-time preacher, guess what they experienced? Sticker shock. Have you ever experienced sticker shock? Yeah, I remember my mother, when I paid $400 for a freezer years ago, she just went bananas. Said, you paid way too much for that. But she was thinking when she bought one back in the 1950s, which cost like $100. And so here he says that I really wasn't doing you a service by not taking any money. So it's authorized to pay preachers, but congregations need to get used to that too. Wouldn't you agree with that? They need to get used to supporting those that preach the gospel. Now, whether or not he was being sarcastic, I don't know, but there's some truth that maybe he did have an inkling of truth that he was asking for their forgiveness because he didn't do them right. Now let's look, this would be the third time. He says in verse 14, he still wouldn't take any money. Why would he not take any money this time? He said, I'm still not going to be taking any money from you. Why would he not take money? What did he not want to be accused of? Working for money. Is that what you said, Mike? He didn't want a burden to him, but he didn't want to be accused of preaching for the money.
This has a pattern of sending preachers from Corinth Hill. He sent it directly to Paul.
Okay.
Sent it to Corinth, and Corinth went back to Paul.
All right. Did everybody hear what Brother Mann said? Here, the pattern here was money was sent directly to the preacher, not through some mother church or missionary society. It was sent directly. That's the pattern. That's what he's talking about. But he still would not take money. He didn't want to be a burden to him. He didn't want to be accused of preaching for the money. And used to, that would never be the case, because I remember reading books where preachers were paid in eggs and chickens. People just didn't have money. And now, here recently, was talking to an elder in another congregation, what it's going to take to hire a preacher, and it's going to take over 6 figures. What would be the temptation in this day and age for a preacher if you're making 6 figures? Preach for the money. And sometimes I'm a little concerned that that's could be a problem in the affluent society in which we live. I don't know any that are preaching for that, but the temptation would certainly be there, right? For that kind of money. Okay. All right. We're going to get to that here in just a moment. He said he didn't seek what they had, but he sought them. He said, I don't want your money. I want you. Hey, y'all remember the old Uncle Sam posters? Uncle Sam dressed up in the patriotic and had the hat on, and he had his finger, and he said, I want you. Well, here Paul is saying the same thing. He wanted their souls. And he used the principle that parents laying up for their children, that parents should provide for their children, not the children for the parents. Now, he's not saying that children not take care of their parents. That's a whole other story. But parents are responsible for their children, and he was their father spiritually. He said that they were his children. He would gladly spend and be spent for them. In verse 15, the more he loved them, he said, the less what? The less they loved him. They accused him of being crafty and using guile, and his intention of not taking the money from them was so that he could get his hands on what? The big collection that was being taken. In verse 16, this big collection, well, they weren't going to, he didn't want the money from the church at Corinth. He wanted it from all the churches. That was the accusation being made against Paul. And he asked if he had taken advantage of them by any that was sent to them. The obvious answer to that question is what? Had he taken advantage of them? And then we get to what Brother Mann just brought up. He used Titus or another brother. They loved Titus. They respected Titus. Did Titus or other brother that was sent, who's unnamed, did they take advantage of the Corinthian brethren? The answer is what? No. And Paul said, I walked in the same spirit and the same steps as who? You have a lot of confidence in Titus and this other brother, then I did the same thing they did. You need to have confidence in me. Now let's look at verse 19. Again, you think that we excuse ourselves unto you, we speak before God in Christ. But we do all things, dearly beloved, for your edification. Paul's intent with the church at Corinth and everywhere he preached was to do what? Whose benefit? Theirs. What does that word edification mean? Build up. That's why Paul preached. Now, let's look at verses 20 and 21. I fear, he says, when I come, I shall not find you such as I would, and that I shall be found unto you such as you would not. Lest there be debates, envyings, wraths, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, and tumults. Unless when I come again, my God will humble me among you, that I shall bewail many which have sinned already, and have not repented of the uncleanness and fornication and lasciviousness which they have committed. Would you say the church at Corinth had some problems? What kind of problems did they have? June, what'd you say? Mouth problems. Okay, they had a problem with the tongue. That's pointed out. Whisperings, backbitings, and all these things. Tumults. Somebody else said something. They also had problems with sins of the flesh, sensual sins. And he said, I'm afraid when I come to you this third time, it's not going to be pretty. He's already said that, hadn't he? And he encouraged them to straighten up. And he feared nothing would change, and it would humble him and cause him to mourn. How does God feel when we sin? Okay. Julia said sad, just like it is with our children. You remember where Ephesians 4, it says we grieve the Holy Spirit when we don't put off the old man. Paul's the same way. It grieved him to see the church in that condition. And his exhortation to them was to do what? What was he wanting them to do? Repent. You take care of this problem before I come. And he's already said this, because when I come, if you don't take care of it, when I come, who's going to take care of it? Paul was. You remember he had said it in 1 Corinthians, do I need to come in the spirit of love or with a rod? It was up to them. Now let's stop here for any comments from the last couple of minutes we have. And we'll finish.
It seems like Jesus appeared to Paul and told him he had much people in the car with him that he didn't tell him about all the problems.
Okay, that's a good point. Back in Acts 18 chapter, when he appeared to Paul and told him and encouraged him, because apparently he was discouraged. He said he had much people in this city, and before it says apparently he didn't tell him these people had a lot of baggage or a lot of problems. So, but is there a church that doesn't have problems? Because we're all what? We're all people. And I've said this for years. If you ever find a perfect church, don't go there, because you'll mess it up. Because I'm not perfect. And if I find a perfect church, I don't need to go there. There's no such thing. But the Lord does give us answers on how to handle and answer and correct problems. And that's the beauty of the gospel of Christ. That it tells us how to be saved, but then it tells us how to live and how to make correction when we sin after being saved. And that's the beauty, again, of the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Next week, we'll finish this book up in chapter 13. And then Brother David is going to begin teaching in the adult class on the Sermon on the Mount. And then upstairs, we'll have a 6-month study on the miracles of Jesus. And we have books for that study. And I'll be teaching the first 3 months, and Dustin will be teaching the last 3 months. Brother Ron.